Welcome to Narratives and Nightcaps. Today's episode features Randy Ribay, a Filipino American author of young adult fiction. Randy's newest novel, Everything We Never Had, comes out August 27th. Previously, his other novel, Patron Saints of Nothing, was a finalist for the National Book Award and LA Times Book Prize. Randy was also a contributor to the Printz-Award winning anthology called The Collectors. His other works include An Infinite Number of Parallel Universes, After the Shot Drops, and Chronicles of the Avatar, The Reckoning of Roku. Born in the Philippines and raised in the Midwest, Randy now lives in the San Francisco Bay Area with his wife, son, and cat-like dog. Welcome. I need to know
Yeah,
more about
thank
your
you.
cat-like dog.
Thank you for having me. It is, yeah, I mean, she's a dog. She's
Yep.
cat-sized, and anything you think of like stereotypically being cat behavior is pretty much how she acts,
Okay.
Seeks out pools of sunlight, likes to be comfortable, very aloof, likes to cuddle on her terms, but if you try to cuddle her when she doesn't want to, or if you shift, she like grumbles and leaves.
Very cat
Yeah,
behavior.
hates water, yeah, all that.
Okay. I have a dog as well. I wouldn't say he has quite reached that cat status, but he does like to climb on the backs of couches, which
Okay.
is and
That's pretty cat-like.
it's pretty cat-like. That's typically how we reference it when he does that. So I definitely get that. Also, where in the Midwest did you grow up?
Michigan primarily. Yeah.
Okay. Was just curious because I grew up in Iowa. Megan, who is typically my co-host, actually lives in Iowa still.
Okay.
So that's how we knew each other. So just Midwest people, I'm always really curious where everyone's from. Awesome. Well, we're super happy to have you here. I can't wait to talk about everything we never had with you. Before we get into that just a little bit, since our show is called Narratives and Nightcaps, I'm curious if you are a coffee person, a tea person, you have an extensive writing career. And so, what fuels you to do all of this?
Yeah, primarily coffee. I have a cup in the morning before I start writing. I have a cup in the afternoon to kind of carry me through those sagging hours. And then sometimes I'll have a little tea if I need like a
A
little
boost.
something, a little boost, but not quite the full-fledged caffeine of a coffee experience.
Absolutely. I'm right there with you. Also trying to dial back on the caffeine a little bit. Still need it in the morning, but
Yeah.
I'm trying to scale back throughout the day.
Yeah, I'm trying to like keep it at 2 cups, but I feel like my body is trying to push me for a third, but
Oh,
I'm
same.
trying to resist.
Same. It's a real mental battle, that's for
Yeah.
sure. Okay, well, for everyone listening, and I know we're recording this even before your book comes out, but let's just start with you telling us a little bit more about what Everything We Never Had is all about.
Yeah, my quick pitch is it's kind of like Filipino American pachinko, but like 1/4 of the length. A little bit more in depth is that it's about father and son relationships across 4 generations of a Filipino American family. And so you get 4 different timelines. The first one is 1929, Watsonville, California, and the last one is 2020 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And yeah, you get each character in this family at the age of 16 as something important is happening in their life and at that moment in history. And then you see them reappear in the other chapters as the next character's father or grandfather or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, really, I love the multi-generational aspect of it. On that note, though, I'm going to jump around with my questions. You're writing different timelines, you're writing different perspectives, essentially. What was your process like with that? Did you have to like start with one to be really focused on
Mhm.
what that person's story was in their present day, or did you flip back and forth?
Yeah. So originally, I sat down to draft it, thinking I would write it kind of like how it's laid out in the final version, right, where they're all intermingled.
Mhm.
Um, and so I was like, yeah, I'll just draft it, and when I feel like it's time for the next chapter or the next section, then I'll jump to that section and I'll write that section. Right away, I found that really difficult to do because I don't typically do a whole lot of outlining before I start writing, especially with my more literary work. And so I just didn't know enough about the characters yet or about what they had gone through in their lives. And so I was trying to write these scenes, and they just were, the characters were feeling really flat. I didn't really know how they would react or what they would say. And so I had to take a step back, and then I ended up drafting it one section at a time chronologically. So I wrote all of Francisco's chapters, which is 1929 Watsonville, and then all of Emil's chapters, 1965 Stockton, California, and so on and so forth. And then after I had all of those, I printed them out on like each one being a different color paper. And then I like laid out the chapters on the floor and tried to figure out like how they would go together in a way that would, contrast or complement each other well. And then it was a matter of rereading it from start to finish and kind of revising and making sure things flowed, making sure, that it was just stitched together neatly.
Absolutely. I think it really contributes to the pace of the story too when you're alternating back and forth with all that. But as I was reading, I was so curious. I was like, I wonder how he did this. Like because I was like, it'd be so difficult in my mind. I was like, it would be really difficult to be flipping back and forth like this. So that's so interesting. For the overall story and these characters, what was the inspiration? I'm sure it's very personal for you, but really what motivated you to want to write this story?
Yeah, so the inspiration for me came from becoming a parent. I had a son 4 years ago, and
Awesome.
like a lot of new parents, I think I was kind of thinking about how I was parented and, what I liked about that and what I wanted to take from it, what I maybe wanted to leave behind, and also like what I needed to heal from still, right? And so I was thinking about that in terms of myself, and then I was also thinking about that in terms of, well, what was it like for my father to be a teenager, right? Speaking particularly about father-son relationships, since I had a son, I was thinking about that particular angle a lot. And then I was thinking about, well, what was his father's experience like, and kind of how those interacted and informed each other. And I think like maybe normal people can just like sit down and think through those questions or talk through them, but I can't really. I have to like make up all these fake people and like play with them like little action figures to work out my own stuff, right? And so then, so that was like the starting point for the story, and that was really the focus of the story. I knew from the beginning I didn't want it to be some 800-page multi-generational epic. That's not what the vision I had for the story, so I wanted to keep it very focused. And because I'm a father, because I have a son, I was focusing specifically on the father-son relationships across the generations.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Um, Throughout all of it, you're talking a lot about Filipino American history. Was was there a lot involved on the research process for yourself, or was some of that like information that you didn't? I know that and this is a topic in the book, like I learned so much by reading it, and it was fascinating, at times also hard to accept that like these are things that I never had heard before, didn't really know. But was there a pretty extensive research process for you to really dig into that, especially looking back? I mean, almost 100 years.
Yeah. So the some of it came from stuff I've kind of learned throughout the years. I mean, I didn't learn anything about Filipino American history in school, right? This was not like a topic that was covered
Nope.
whatsoever. And even when you learn about like the farm workers movement, in the 60s, you hear about Cesar Chavez, maybe Dolores Huerta, and the Mexican laborers kind of being the heart of that movement, but you don't hear about the Filipinos very much. And
Right.
so a lot of that I kind of self-educated later in life by, reading, paying attention, uh, and talking with people. And so there was some of it that I already knew that they kind of had in place, right? So I knew as I started to write the story, I knew I wanted to center the first one around the Watsonville riots, which are touched on in the story, a period of 5 days when mobs of white people went around and basically beat the crap out of every Filipino person they could find and vandalized and ended up killing somebody. And so I knew I wanted to start there. I knew about the Filipino side of the Filipino farm or the United Farm Workers movement. I knew about Marcos and all of that kind of coming into it. But I think like a lot of that I kind of knew in general, but not specifically. So it was a lot of going in and finding primary sources from the time period, as well as doing preliminary research on Wikipedia and whatever else I could find online. I was, at the time I was working on this, I was living on university campus, so I had access to like all of the books that they had and
Oh, that's
the
fantastic.
databases that they had, which was valuable. And one of the most important things was, especially with Watsonville, the oldest timeline in the story, I ended up finding an organization called Watsonville is in the Heart, which is it's UC Santa Cruz. It's a historical organization that works with a community organization called the Tobera Project from Watsonville. And they had a project around creating digital archives of family stories from that region. And so that was extremely valuable. Those archives weren't publicly available yet, but I reached out to the researchers and they gave me early access to it. And so I was able to hear these like oral histories they had recorded, see these photographs they had put together, which was extremely valuable for just thinking about what life looked like for Filipino laborers in the Manong generation in that area, that went beyond kind of even the kind of high level headline type of research that you would find mostly about the Watsonville riots and stuff. And so that was extremely valuable. At one point when I was drafting, I was getting bogged down with like a lot of like research details. So I had like done preliminary research. I'd looked at a lot of stuff myself, but I would get stuck on certain things of like, I'm writing this scene. How did they harvest apples in 1929 in Watsonville, right? And then I would spend like all this time trying to look that up, and that would kind of be my writing time for the day, because at the time I was working on this, I was still teaching full time, and I was only writing like hour and a half in the mornings before I went to work. And so I ended up hiring a research assistant, and I would send her a list of questions like every Sunday or something, and then she had the following Monday to like get to do her research and get answers and give me the sources for her answers, so I could go and look into stuff more detail if I want to. And so that helped me like keep the flow of drafting the story, so I wasn't getting hung up on these minor things.
To stay focused.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. That's so cool. You make me think of another interview too, though, when it comes to historical fiction and everything. I was reading an author interview and she goes, it's really weird to write historical fiction because you're sitting there typing one day and you're in the midst of these characters, dialogue or something, and then all of a sudden you think, wait, do they have towels? Like what is she gonna use a towel to wipe the counter? Like there are those really little details where all of a sudden you're like, wait, I don't know how they actually did that then.
Yeah, and there are a lot of them too, because like like the details is how you make the story feel alive, but then you get caught up in that, and like you just don't know some of this stuff, or at least I didn't know a lot of it. And you want, not to say like most readers would even know if there were towels back then or whatever, right? But
someone out there would point it out.
Someone out there would know, and it would take them out of the story. And so it is kind of like trying to find that balance between doing the research to make the story feel realistic and accurate, but also not getting so lost in the research hole, right? Because at the end of the day, I'm not a historical nonfiction writer. I'm not a historical academic, right? I'm telling a story, and I want that story to feel as real and be as historically accurate as possible. And I want to be aware of when I'm intentionally straying from historical record. But at the same time, it's challenging not to spend all your time researching, because there's so much more, and then you find out more, and there's even more you want. There's like all these different rabbit holes you can go down. So it's hard to kind of rein that in and stay focused.
No, I appreciate your transparency about all of it, because not only are you trying to make an authentic story, but the reality of that as a fiction writer. That's so interesting. Through all of this, and if you don't want to share, that's fine. Did you learn anything about like your own family and ancestry as you were doing either reflecting or looking into history? Did it bring up any questions that you were curious about for your own family?
Yeah, so one thing that came up while I was thinking through this story and working on the story was I was thinking about World War II, because I have a section in there where a character's talking about kind of what her family was going through during World War II in the Philippines. And I had like never really thought about it before, but I'm like, wait, like my Lola, my grandmother, was alive during World War. Like my grandparents were alive during World War II when Japan had occupied the Philippines and done really terrible crimes against humanity for like 3 or 4 years. And I'm just like, what was her experience? Like, and unfortunately, by the time that I had that question, my Lola's health was rapidly fading, and her English wasn't so good anymore. So I had to like relay it to my dad, and my dad went and asked, and he was like, also like, I never really knew this either. But he asked her, and apparently, what they did, because they like live in the provinces outside of the cities, the major cities, is they just like went and hid in the mountains. Like when they heard the Japanese were coming, they like would just pack up and like go and hide in the mountains and like live in the mountains for a while
Oh
until
my
people
goodness.
were like, oh, it's clear the Japanese are gone for now, and then they would go back. And then when they heard about the Japanese coming again, they would go back and hide in the mountains. Yeah, so that was wildly interesting to me.
Wow. I listen to this other podcast all the time, and one thing they always talk about is talk to your grandparents, ask them what their stories are, where they came from, because like you said, like we think about it later on and we're like, oh, I have all these questions. Even,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think a lot about like my uh, grandma has been passed for a few years now too. And there was a time period where I did a school project and I, wrote down how she taught in a one-room schoolhouse
Mm-hmm.
and all of this. And I'm like, man, I wish I had thought about that more at that
Mm-hmm.
time and asked more questions and really got into the details of what her life was like. So it's anyone that listens, like ask your grandparents if they're around what their lives were like, because it's so important to
Yeah.
hear those things and you'll have those questions later on.
Yeah, and one thing it made me want to do, and I haven't done this yet, is like, yeah, record my parents like telling their life stories, right? Just like ask them questions and just record, I don't know, video or just voice, just so that's something that like everybody in the family would have for years to come.
Yeah, that's one of the benefits of technology right now and use that where you can. I think the same thing with my parents too. They also have so many great stories and I think about that. I need to do it too, have it, but
Mhm.
I also need to capture all of that. Um, so, on top of the history and the ancestry, your novel really explores a couple of heavy themes with like generational trauma, toxic masculinity, anxiety as well. Um, these can be heavy topics to write, they can be heavier things to read too, but there's also like, did you experience a sense of vulnerability while writing all of these things too, even if you weren't necessarily feeling those personally? I would imagine it's a bit vulnerable to put that on paper.
Yeah, I mean, I think anything that you write is is
It
vulnerable.
all is for
Uh,
sure.
and so I don't know. I guess I've been doing this long enough that like I accept that and like lean into it rather than try to hide myself from the page a little bit more. Um, and so definitely, obviously as a male growing up in a deeply patriarchal society, that's something that I was greatly affected by, harmed by, and continue to think about and try to unlearn and try to heal from. Frequent topic of conversation in my therapy sessions. Um, and so, yeah, and there's something, I listed in the back of the book, there's a bunch of resources. And one of the books that I listed is The Will to Change by Bell Hooks, which is kind of all about that. And yeah, it was one of the books that I was reading and thinking a lot about as I was working on the story in terms of my characters as well as myself. And yeah, and the anxiety thing is also that's mine as well. And thinking about how Enzo describes his anxiety as kind of like taking the feels like murder hornets. Is kind of like, yeah, that's kind of how mine physically feels to me, which is
Hmm.
something that I realized a few years ago. So yeah, so just kind of bringing that to the page and finding ways to. There's like pieces of like every character I connect with in some way, shape, or form, because I've found like early on, I think in my writing, that like if I can't connect to some character in any way, then that character is going to feel very fake to me. And if it feels fake to me, or if it feels like a cardboard cutout to me, then it's going to feel like that to the readers, I think.
No, I think that makes sense. And that's all very, really well said. Even though, even like with these characters being males, as a female reader, I still felt like there were things that I could connect to too. But it does, putting yourself in them, even if it's just a one quality or something makes it more realistic. I'm sure like we feel those emotions a lot more with those characters, but I could relate a lot to the anxiety and obviously just being in our society right now, a lot of those things. So I appreciate the way that you unpacked those, and it just it gives a lot of perspective the way though that you laid it out between the generations, and I find that so fascinating. Even I was standing in line at we had a restaurant open up down here that I've been really excited about.
Mhm.
And they were giving out free food for 2 hours, and I told my husband, I was like, we've got to go because I will stand in whatever line to get that, like we were going. And I brought the book with me, and I was standing in line, and this woman, she was like, oh, you were prepared for a line. I was like, yeah, I figured I'd be here for a while. And she was like, well, what are you reading? And I started to tell her all about it, but I was just like, I couldn't stop once I did, because I love the aspect of the different generations and the perspective that it gives, because I think that's also really important in our society today, is
Mhm.
like having perspective and empathy. And it's a conversation we were having with Ellen Hopkins recently too, where empathy is something that people are almost looking down on now, but
Mhm.
reading stories like this and many, many, many others helps really develop that so that you can understand what someone else is going through.
Yeah, that's well said. Thank you. Yeah, I think like I think it's like sometimes it's like hardest uh, to to feel that empathy for people we know the best sometimes, right? 'Cause sometimes it's not. Sometimes there's so much history sometimes between you and this other person that's close to you that I think it sometimes creates a block, right? Like we think we know them, we think we know what's going on with them. We have our assumptions about who they are or what they've been through or their values or whatever, that it creates this block and makes it hard to truly empathize with them. And I think that happens a lot with parents and their children, right? There's just so much history there that a lot of times
Yes.
it does create that block of kind of like, yeah, I can be empathetic with this person on the other side of the world I don't know that well, or I can be empathetic with my friends who I don't
Yeah.
see nearly every waking moment of my life.
That's
But
oh,
yeah.
that's so good. Man, I think I needed to hear that. So thanks for saying that. Um, wow. I want to know more about like the beginning of your writing career. Have you always known that I mean, I'm sure like writing sounds like it's very therapeutic for you at the same time. So like, have you always kind of known that you wanted to be an author, or where did your story really begin?
Yeah. So yeah, I'm not the kind of writer that was like, oh, I wanted to be an author, and I was like writing novels when I was 8 years old, and
Me
whatever.
either. So you're in good
That's not.
company.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't really start writing, like sit down and actually writing fiction regularly until my late 20s. Um, and when I was growing up, though, I loved stories. Right. I read a lot, watched a lot of movies and TV shows. I played a lot of video games that were very story based, and yeah, and so I think that love of stories was always there. But at the same time, I didn't know anyone who was a writer. I didn't know anyone who was any kind of practicing artist, right? There was nobody in my family, nobody, that was friends with our family or anything that was like, oh, I'm a photographer or, I'm a painter or whatever, like nobody. And so I don't think I ever really thought that it was like not that I was explicitly like, oh, I can't be a writer, but to me, like writing wasn't even like a profession real people had, right? I guess I just thought like the books just kind of poofed into existence.
It's kind of how it seems, for people that don't know the industry a little bit. They're just
Yeah,
like, oh, and then they became an overnight sensation.
yeah,
And I'm always like, no, 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 that's probably years and years of work.
so then I went to college for aerospace engineering, and I did not like that. After a year, it was just kind of like, this is not what I want to do with my life. Nothing against engineering, but it just wasn't for me. And I think when we are not living in accordance with who we are, our soul feels it and we feel unhappy or dissatisfied. And so I switched majors. One of my favorite high school teachers had told me to just major, like study whatever you're interested in and think about what job you'll get later, which is kind of the opposite of how I had grown up, right? I had grown up very much with you study what will get you a secure job later in life. And so I switched to English because I was like, all right, apparently you can study stories.
I like those.
Yeah,
Let's do that.
yeah. And so I started, reading a lot, and I think like in those college years, I started to develop the urge to write, but still was kind of like a little bit afraid to dip in. And started writing poetry those years, though. Read a lot of poetry, started writing poetry. And then after college, became a teacher, English teacher. And I was teaching middle school and then high school. And I think, I had been reading so much. I was also writing book reviews for the Horn Book. And I just read so much because I thought to be a good teacher, I also needed to know what stories were out there, right? I needed to know not just the canon or the classics, but what was coming out. And so I tried to read very widely across genres because I also believed that, I also strongly believe that when a kid's like, I hate reading or whatever, like my core belief is that no, you probably hate the kind of books that you're forced to read in school, but you just need to find what's interesting to you. So I was reading all over the place, so I could like recommend books to kids, know what was out there. And then just like gradually, I still was writing poetry from time to time and still kind of had this desire to write a little bit. And so eventually it was like, all right, I think I want to try this. And one summer, instead of teaching summer school or painting houses or whatever I did sometimes in the summers, I was like, I'm just going to take the summer and I'm just going to try to like write a book and see how it goes finally. So I did that, and then it got rejected a whole bunch of places because I queried it way too early, and it was also not a great book. And then did the same thing with like the next couple of summers. So I had written 3 manuscripts. They all got rejected by every agent I sent them to. And then eventually went back to the second one I had written, spent several months like revising it very heavily. And that's the one, that's Infinite Number of Parallel Universes, which a lot of people doesn't even know exists because it was with like a small press, and I don't even think it's like in print anymore. And so that got me my first agent and my first book deal, very, very tiny book deal. But that was my inroads into the industry.
Very nice. No, I appreciate how that side of things is what everyone doesn't see, the having multiple manuscripts and querying it and being rejected. And it's hard, but like I feel like that is what makes an author today, is still being determined and willing to like readjust and pivot and learn from that too, which I think is a quality that a lot of writers have, is just this posture of like always wanting to learn, whether it's about like writing in general and the craft or genres or what people are reading. So I appreciate that. I think, like I was saying, on the outside, people always say, they're like, oh, they just became this overnight sensation. It's not just writers too. I even, this is very random, but I was with my dad recently and he was like, Sabrina Carpenter, she just like popped up out of nowhere. And I was like, oh, I think she's been, working pretty hard. I go, and then it was interesting because I saw someone sort of do this analysis of one of her shows, and they go, the way that she actually performs is a sign of someone who's been putting in years and years of work, because if she truly did just come out overnight, she would not be able to get up on stage the way that she does. And I think that it's similar for, every industry, writing included. That
I think about that a lot too, in terms of like actors sometimes, will be like, oh, this like breakout actor, and you're like looking at their past, it's like, oh, they did like improv and stand-up comedy for like 20 years, right? They like put in the work just because they weren't kind of mainstream popular, but they're doing the work still.
No, that's so I appreciate you sharing your story and your journey.
I think also like I don't know, as a culture, we're obsessed with youth and newness, right? So there's like always so much celebration over like debut authors and like huge debut book deals, and like authors that's their first book and it just like drops at number 1 on the New York Times bestseller list, right? that happens, but that doesn't usually happen, right? That is like by far the exception. But then like it's that story is told so much and it's like so desirable that I think a lot of new writers like think that, have it in their head that like that's what success means, right? To have this like breakout first novel, when a vast majority of writers I know wrote several books before they even got published, and maybe even published several books before they even wrote something that a fair number of people heard of.
Right. No, absolutely. We were having a similar conversation with MK Pagano about that, where, I mean, her debut book just came out, but she was like, she's like, I have like 5 other finished manuscripts. I've had so many no's. I was talking with an author a writer who's not published and everything, and he was in the process of querying, and he got his first rejection, and he was just so down. And in the back of my head, I was like, oh, buckle up. Like, it's like, it's going to be a lot of no's. Like, you can't take it personally. You just gotta, like, if it's a no, well, in my head, I was kind of like, I think it was nice of them to actually give a rejection, because most people just ignore you.
Mhm.
So it was very kind of them to say, hey, sorry, not for us.
Mhm.
I don't know. I do feel like we need to lift up those journeys a little bit more, because it's encouraging then for a lot of the other writers. What you're saying too, related, is as a society too, I think we also, I personally, I know what kind of stops me from writing is I'm like, it needs to be perfect. It has to be perfect. And it's like, well, that's not the case at
Mhm.
all. And every writer that when their book gets there, like they've had a team, they've had years that they've gone through on their own journey to get it there.
Mhm.
Um, even if it was their debut book that, New York Times bestseller right off, I'm sure that there's something behind what got them to that
Yeah.
spot. A lot of
Yeah.
hard work and everything.
And when we compare ourselves to, somebody who's like a published writer or whatever it is, right? Like, yeah, like you're looking at that published book, you're not seeing any of the previous drafts. You're not seeing any of the editorial feedback that helped that book get to where it was, from probably, half a dozen people that gave them feedback along the way, at least. And so it's not, yeah, that comparison thing is just so tricky, right? Because it's also natural to do that, to be like, oh, am I good enough to do this thing too? But yeah, the more we're aware of the work that goes into it behind the scenes, I think the more, I don't know, the more persistence we can
Yeah.
maintain. Yeah.
No, I definitely think so. Well, so we've kind of been giving all of it, but if you had to sum it up or give like one piece of advice, what would you say to someone who's either a new writer or wants to write? What would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I think the three typical pieces of advice that I give, which I don't think are like terribly revelatory, but I think they're very practical, is like one is read a lot, right? Uh, read a lot in the genre that you want to write in. I think sometimes people have this idea of like, oh, I don't want to write like everybody else, so I'm not going to read any books like this, right? But I think that's mistaken. um, I think you should know what's out there. You should know what other people are doing, so you can also, I think, kind of toy with that, or just kind of think about that more. And so so read a lot, read all over the place, watch TV, watch movies, all story, everything's a story. But also thinking about like, try to get into the head of the writers or the director. If you're watching something and you love it, why do you love it so much? Something's making you cry, like how did it make you cry? If something is boring you to tears, like why is it boring you to tears, right? Like anything you think about, like anything you consume, you can learn from if you're thinking about it right in the right way. My second piece of advice is to write a lot, right? Writing is a skill like anything else. The more you do, the more writing you do, the better you get at it. The more you find your voice. And then the flip side of that is revising is also a skill. So I think writing things, getting them to a point where they're finished, and practicing revising, practicing moving things around, deleting things to enhance the story, right? I think that's something that gets overlooked a lot. And then my third piece of advice is usually just to be curious, kind of like what you mentioned earlier, right? Be curious about yourself, be curious about other people, be curious about history, be curious about the world, right? Because all of that stuff that we wonder about, that we read about, that we seek information about, like works its way into what you create. And if you're not curious, that's kind of like trying to make a sandwich with no ingredients, right? It's like there's
Yeah,
nothing there.
goodness, I think I don't even have it with me. There's this book I have. How I hope I don't say the title wrong. It's called like The Art of Curiosity. I'm pretty sure, by Brian Glazer, and So I will say I love to read across genres, but the one I struggle with is nonfiction.
Mm,
Despite the fact that I love historical fiction, when it comes to nonfiction, that's just one area that is what I struggle a bit with those. But that book, I got it years ago, actually, and it was so fascinating to me because I feel like you're right. We need to maintain like this sense of curiosity and asking questions. Like it's okay to ask questions about something and want to dig into that a little bit more. And I don't want to lose that art, but that book was just that was a nonfiction book that I was immediately hooked in. It has a lot to do with like media and theater and
mm,
movies and all of that too, and storytelling in general. So I'm glad you brought that up. They might be practical, but I think they're good advice, and they're all worth saying. Read a lot, write a lot, stay curious.
mhm.
All super important, and I don't know, even overlooked at times. So that's fantastic advice. So with that though, with writing and everything, without spoiling the book, what would you say was either your favorite scene to write or like the most moving for you as you were writing it, or both?
Uh, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think I like I like writing uh the scenes where like things bubble to the surface and characters are finally saying what they've been wanting to say for a long time. Because I think the when you write realistic fiction, that's often the equivalent of like a fight scene, right? It's like you have this tension that's building because these characters have these subtextual feelings or conflicting desires or thoughts that they are kind of holding in or dancing around. And then usually, a lot of times the climactic moment in a lot of contemporary fiction is these get voiced finally, right? So yeah, so I'm not gonna like I won't tell you specifically, but each timeline has some scenes where like those things come to the surface finally, and the characters say it.
Absolutely.
And I think that's always, for me, it's always fun to write because it's interesting. It is kind of thinking about those moments, like what is finally going to get them to say it out loud? How is that going to impact the other person? A lot of times, those are things that do need to be said aloud, but it's kind of interesting to think about how the particular characters would receive them in that moment, right? Yeah.
Definitely. Very good. Well, I noticed on your website with this coming out, you have a couple of events and things coming up. Where can people find you over the next few months?
Yeah, so I'll be in a lot of different places.
I
I'll
saw.
be like trying to even remember. Um, yeah, so I have a book launch on August 30th. I don't know when this is going to air, but August 30th at
Next Wednesday, whatever day
okay,
that
yeah,
is.
so that's before that
Yep.
at Linden Tree Books in Los Altos, and I'll be in conversation with Jandy Nelson. Uh, I will be at uh, the Lit Up Festival in Kansas City, Missouri in mid September. I'll be touring, doing like a bookstore school visit tour in the first week of October for Everything We Never Had. And I'll be in the Philly area, the Chicago area, Milwaukee, Minneapolis, and then LA area for that. So it's first week of October. And then I'll be at New York Comic Con for my Avatar book in mid October, and then I'll be at NCTE in Boston, I think. Yeah, in November. Sorry, that was a lot.
No, that's awesome. That's so much to look forward to. I know that's really, really busy, and I'm sure having a 4-year-old and everything just contributes to the busyness of that. But that's super exciting that you have all of that coming up for this book and your other ones too. That's fantastic. For people that can't meet you in those locations, where can they find you?
Yeah, most often these days I'm on Instagram, just at Randy Ribay. I have a Twitter still and a Threads, but I don't really use them. I think I have a Facebook that I don't really use that often. Instagram is where I mostly am these days. Yeah.
Okay. I'm not that's pretty consistent with every author we talk to, and I
Yeah.
appreciate that because I don't really want to be anywhere else
Yeah,
either.
I feel too old for TikTok, and I have a website, but I don't think anyone goes to websites anymore.
except me. And I will go ahead and plug that your website has a lot of other really great resources with like about Filipino American history, other books. So anyone that is interested, like your website does have amazing, great information
Thank you.
about you, but then other resources too, which I really appreciate that you dive into that a lot more because I think it's important not only for me, super informative. And so I'm going to go ahead and plug it if you won't. Well, I have seriously enjoyed our conversation, getting to know you, hearing more about your book, everything that inspired it, the history as well. Appreciate all of your advice too, that I think applies not only to anyone that's writing, but just anyone in any walk of life. So I'm super grateful. And Everything We Never Had is available on August 27th. So, this episode comes out, I'm pretty sure the day
The day
after.
after. Yep.
Yep. Okay. So, everyone can go get this book. And thank you again.
Yeah. Thank you again for having me.
Absolutely. Cheers.
Cheers.